Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Jesus Trejo Book Club. Just a big shout out to everyone that checked out episode 0 and episode 1. We're over 1,000 views, and that is exciting to me. So thank you to everyone that's taking the time to watch the episode. Tell a friend, share it. There's been a lot of people who have shared the little clips that we put out from the episode. So thank you so much. People seem to be very excited. It was really cool to get some text messages from some friends and family that they will be tuning in. So shout out to you guys. Thank you. Yeah, super excited. This past week, I got to do some book readings. I want to send out a big shout out to New Academy in Canoga Park. Uh, I had the warmest welcome ever. They had balloons with my name on it. They had tacos there. They had plants with eyeballs from this book. It was really sweet. I got to read the book to the whole school, and it was really great. And yeah, it felt special. It reminded me why I'm yeah, it reminded me why I wrote this book. I feel very lucky to share that story with everyone, and hopefully we'll be doing more. But without further ado, I want to introduce you this week's guest. Um, I knew I was gonna blank out and, and get the introduction uh, incorrect. A social impact. Okay, yeah, there we go. I'm gonna try this again. All right, my next guest, I'm very excited to have. She works across many spaces, one of which is social impact. Full disclosure, she is my wife and the translator of the books. Thank you for being here.
Hi, baby.
Hello.
Can I call you baby?
Sure. Sure.
I realize that I never call you by your name, so
Yeah.
people are gonna hear us just hear all
Or
the
we're gonna get
names,
pulled into
all the
HR. Is
nicknames.
like, are y'all dating? Y'all can't date if y'all in the same company. It's like, well, listen, we're married. um, yeah, thank you so much. We actually drove in the same car here.
Yeah,
So
I'm glad we both made it on time.
we're we're both looking at each other like, yeah, we're trying to make it seem like, oh, hey, how's it going?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was excited to hear your intro and how you would introduce me.
Yeah, and I messed up, of course, because I never know what to say. And proof that she still makes me nervous. So that's a good thing, right? You don't want to lose that, I hear. But yeah, this is super exciting. Can you tell myself included, us, like a little what the did I say it right? Social impact?
Yes, I'm a social impact consultant. So, what that means is I work across different sectors. So, it could be private sector, it could be the government or the nonprofit sector or entertainment, tech. And I work on social impact initiatives. So, it could also be advocacy campaigns or culture change campaigns. So, advocacy, social impact, different names, but
That's so cool. One of the cool things is like I remember when we first met, we got to talking a little bit more, and at the time you were working at the MPAA, right?
the Motion Picture Association, yeah.
Motion Picture
Mhm,
Association, and before that, you were working at the White House
mhm.
under Obama's administration, Department of Education,
Yes.
right?
Well, I worked at the Department of Education, so also worked with the White House, but it was under the Obama administration.
Administration. That's so
Yes.
cool. Uh, how was your time there at Department of Ed?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. When I first started working with nonprofits back in the day, the first nonprofit that I ever worked for
Mhm.
was an education nonprofit. So, like, education advocacy has been a huge part of my career. It was where I got my start in like, marketing, sort of my expertise is marketing. So I
Mhm.
do marketing and social media and um, content creation,
Mhm.
but it's always been under sort of advocacy and social impact. So the first industry or area that I focused on was education, and so
Education.
to do that for the Obama administration was
Felt special, I'm
yes,
sure.
life changing, life
Yeah.
changing. I miss those days.
Yes, we miss those days, and it's so cool to see like the photos you have at home. You know, you have photos of you like with what is it, Senator
The secretary, yeah.
Secretary John King, right?
Yeah, former
Yes.
Secretary John King. So for those, ed folks, who are familiar. So the secretary for the first 7 years of the administration was Secretary Arnie Duncan. And he actually stepped down on the last year of the Obama administration. And
Okay.
that's when Secretary John came in.
Mm.
And with him, he brought on new teams, and he had like 1 year to get as much done
Whoa.
as possible. And
No
so
pressure, right?
I was one of the sort of new people that came in the very last year and were like, all right, everyone, we have less than a year before we're out of a job.
Wow.
Let's do as much as we can. So it was truly like a life-changing experience.
Wow. Yeah, because you went on the road and everything, right? You were like
Mhm.
visiting different states and
Yep.
yeah, that's
So my job at the Department of Education, I was the director of digital content. And so I oversaw all of the social media platforms for the Department of Education and what content went on those.
mhm.
So our team, we were always in the know of like what work was happening across the country and sort of trying to get the secretary's work out there, and what we were doing, to improve public education, to support teachers. Secretary John King had a really strong agenda around equity. He really cared about equity.
Mhm.
And so it was really cool to travel around the country with him and sort of help tell the story of the administration's work and the Department of Education's work. And I also happened to manage the secretary's social media accounts.
Oh, very
So
cool.
I was like his ghostwriter. Um, and fun fact, the secretary, who is half Black, half Puerto Rican, he really cared about also communicating with Latinos and reaching out and engaging with Latinos and Spanish speaking audiences. So as an unofficial part of my job is I would, have meetings with him for him to practice his Spanish.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool because that work across different sectors kind of came around full circle when we started collaborating here. Like,
Yeah.
did you have? I'm sure you were asked to translate stuff at a certain point, but it's more like legal documents or speeches or something like that, right?
I have done legal translations. So, I was so excited to work with you as a translator for this book,
Hmm.
even though my career hasn't been focused on like just, focusing on translations alone.
Right.
But a long time ago, I did some translations for a lawyer. And so it was sort of like a random job that I had,
Oh, cool.
that I would do legal translations. But outside of that, I think it has to do with the fact that because I've always worked in marketing and communications,
Hmm.
and so many times I was the only Latina in the team
Right.
and the only like bilingual speaker in the team, then, people were like, how do we get, more resources in Spanish? And so it was always something that I was eager to support and advance and, promote within organizations. And just also learning through that was, okay, we need to think about like how to have appropriate processes
Hmm.
for, to have, a good process to edit and to understand what materials we're putting out and distributing, because as you know, like language is so complex.
Yeah. Tricky.
So it started off as just sort of like me being the volunteer, being like, oh, I speak Spanish, to really like diving in and being intentional and
Hmm.
guiding organizations and how to implement effective practices to actually distribute good resources, bilingual resources.
And the people watching right now, now you know why I didn't nail it. It's very complex. I mean, there was no way I was gonna remember that. I felt like as you're saying that, like it almost feels like when you forget somebody's name, it's like, "Hey, how would you pronounce your name?" It's like, "Did you forget?" Yes, it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's a mouthful, and you've had so much, a very diverse background. It's like your
Yeah.
portfolio is very diverse, and it's really cool to see where your work has taken you. And here we are when I had the opportunity. Which again, always a big shout out to Maria Russo who had the vision to have a book like this be a dual release in Spanish and
Yeah.
English. And when we got the translations, they were great and all, but I wanted someone with a similar background to mine. Is like
Mhm,
you had an upbringing in Juarez,
mhm,
Mexico, and
mhm,
you know me being born here in Long Beach, but my parents from Mexico. You know, you understood the language at a deeper level, and I think I
mhm.
was very lucky in being able to ask and be like, yeah, what, like, of course, let's work with Adria to do the translation. And to
Mhm.
me, that was special because we got to collaborate on both books, right?
Yeah.
But with the first book, it was interesting, right? So let's dive into the first book, Papa's Magical Water Jug Clock.
Mhm.
That book was interesting because as we're doing the translation, like one of the translations that we got back was, I think the word for grass was cesspit, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I had never heard that in my life. And
Yeah.
you know, being the son of a landscaper and working with my dad my whole life, I had never heard that.
Yeah.
And it's like I recognized, like I looked it up and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's grass." It's like I grew up saying grama, zacate, and and that to me, it was to me that moment was like, "Oh man, I'm so glad I get to work with you
Yeah.
because you would know that, like you've heard because you even worked overseas, different countries, Latin American countries, so you know the many words." So, do you remember that moment when we were?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's funny because even before we got to work together in the book,
Mhm.
we had so many of those moments, just
Yes.
us talking to each other. And like we both come from similar backgrounds, meaning we're
Yes.
both Mexican, Mexican American, and our Spanish is completely different.
Yeah, I always put it this way, the Spanish that I speak is like Boomhauer Spanish, and she speaks Harry Potter Spanish. So, I'm like in Spanish, imagine the dango dango, it's like it's very different because it's a mix of like American, like LA,
Yeah.
Spanish and Spanglish put together.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting because I learned so many words
Yeah.
from
And
you.
I learned a word from you that I'd never heard before.
For example,
For example, pajuelear. Vamos
pajuelear.
a pajuelear. I had no clue. I never heard that word before.
Pajuelear is a word that not very many people, have heard, but I heard it a lot in my upbringing, and it means to go out for a stroll, like, "Let's
Mhm.
go out for a walk, a
Yeah.
pajuelear." And, yeah, when I said it, you laughed very hard, and
Yeah.
then you brought it up to your parents, and they were like, "Yeah, we've never heard that."
My parents laughed too. Well, I think what's really cool and interesting, one, I never thought I would find myself working in publishing in a children's book. So, like, I think I'm so lucky and we're so lucky that we got to collaborate on this
Yes.
together. Like, I mean, I'm always game for like cool projects and,
Sure.
being married to a comedian, I get that, the fortune to have a lot of really cool projects to watch you work on. And
Mhm.
so this was just like add that to things I never thought I'd do in my life.
Yeah.
Um, but there were so many experiences that I could bring from from my career. So,
Yeah.
for example, I happen to move a lot for work. I've lived in different states in the country. And because I was always in that role of sort of the marketer that is Latina and that is working on bilingual stuff, I very quickly learned that like Latino communities look very different on
Right.
one side of the country to another. Obviously, you know, Latinos are not a monolith, and language reflects that. And
Sure.
so, it was important for me to understand, like, when working in marketing materials or communication, it's like, okay, who are we trying to speak to,
Right.
and who are we trying to like? What is the message that we're trying to send? Anybody that has worked in translations will tell you that like it can be complex, like, you can translate one thing in so many different ways,
Yeah.
and oftentimes you'll get back and forth with translators and almost becomes like, "Well, what is a better way to say it?" My way to say it.
Yeah, because there's never fully the right way, right? This is the most appropriate way to communicate what we're trying to say. But it's
Yep,
it'll forever. It's almost like an art piece. It's never done technically. You can
yep,
keep adding to it, moving it, but once you reach a point where you're like, this feels good,
yeah,
and also we also work together. Which do you remember? When I had my Showtime special come out, I
mhm,
was planning on doing a Spanish version. I was touring
yeah,
in Mexico. I had done shows in Spanish,
yeah,
but we got you recommended to do the translation.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mhm.
your niece.
Yeah.
Yeah, your niece to do the
Shout
translation.
out to
Yeah.
my prima,
Oh, prima.
my
I'm sorry.
prima, my cousin.
Um, yeah, it was very complex, and that to me when I started touring in Mexico is when I
Mhm.
realized that you are gonna lose certain things, right?
Yep.
So there's
Not everything translates.
not everything translates, like certain similes and metaphors,
Yeah.
and now you're dealing with colloquialisms.
Yeah.
It's complex. So I remember when I got the transcript back with the translation, just to study it. I remember it's like, oh, like I lost, um, if I remember correctly, almost 20 minutes to the hour. So I
Mhm.
have an hour special in English, and the
Mhm.
Spanish is only about 40 minutes worth.
Yeah.
And that was like a big whoa, like that's so interesting because certain words, and even as you're saying, like the jokes that do work, you're saying them out of order because you're
Yeah.
not saying the red car, you're saying car red,
Yeah.
so you're buffering and you're thinking in real time.
Yeah.
And that's why, language is so complex in that way.
Yeah. I think, like, going back to your story about césped, right? You can literally translate anything, right? I mean, Google Translate will do a lot of work for you,
Mhm.
but it really takes a human to understand what you're trying to say, what
Yeah.
is the message, what is the tone, what is the feeling that you're trying to
Yeah.
convey. And so for this book, I remember like we had several back and forths on like I said, I don't, if I was working for the Department of Education,
Right.
obviously like we always care about grammar, period. But, it's very different to translate something that's more technical or,
Mhm.
if it's academic curriculum, but in this case, you're talking about children's book,
Right.
right? And I was more interested in figuring out what little Jesus would call things growing up. So, on the first book, you have like a whole spread of tools, like
Yeah.
gardening tools.
That was another thing too.
And I was like, I know that if I look up the name of each of these tools, they're going to be words that neither you have used or I have used ever.
Sure.
And so I really enjoyed getting to hear from you what you remember them by, right? And I thought that was so special to say, hey, like it's not about what's proper Spanish according to the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, but like it's about what little Jesus experienced with his family. Like this book is about celebrating that immigrant experience, right?
Mhm.
Immigrants come to a new country and their language transforms and it adapts
Yeah.
and it's preserved in a certain way. So
Right.
there's so many cultural nuances.
'Cause
So,
we even reached out. Do you remember that we reached out to, Dr. Medina,
oh yeah, Dr.
who
Medina.
told us about this kind of this third space, this translingual,
Yeah.
uh, he talks a lot about translingual education,
Yep.
and I think we were pleased to hear after we had done this translation that it's okay to have words like, what was the word that we were, having a hard time with? It was,
Was it the tool?
bloa.
Oh yeah.
Bloa,
Well, it
queche,
was
reque, it's like
yes, there was one tool in particular that I was like, "What would you call
el
this?"
video.
And you said, I think Weedio or Weewa or something, and I was like, "Weewa, what is that?" Because it's a weed whacker.
Yeah,
And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like that is so cool." Like your dad took that word and that was part, it's not a made up word, it comes
yeah,
from somewhere. And so, both with grass,
sure.
it could be I said, "I know you didn't call it césped, it was either pasto or zacate." What was your choice?
Yeah, zacate, yeah,
Zacate.
yeah,
And so it was really about, understanding and celebrating and highlighting the nuances of the
yeah.
Spanish that you grew up speaking, as someone who was born and raised in Long Beach. So that's why I'm so proud of it because it truly reflects, your upbringing and your family.
Well, it reflects it, but it
Mhm.
also made me reflect, like, my upbringing, like, literally, like, sit with it and go, queche, reque, it's like, these were words that I don't it's like the word "the" is like, "Oh, sure, okay, that's a word," you
Yeah.
don't think about it, but when I sat with the words, I'm like, "Okay, well, how did we get here?" And I realized that my dad would say, "Reque," and
Yeah.
it's his way of saying rake. I'm like, it comes from the word rake, but
Yep.
it's his own rendition of it. Queche, it took me a while, but it was catcher.
Oh,
So it's like the dustpan,
yeah.
the big landscaping dustpan kind of thing where you put, you sweep the leaves into.
Yeah.
So to me, that was like a big yeah, that was a big moment for me where I sat there and reflected with a lot of the words and grammar, all this stuff is very important. You said something earlier, which was the Google Translate of it all. I think Google does a great job of giving you a starting place, but
Mhm.
it's very complex. You got to sit with it. I remember this meme, and I think I told you about this. When the Pope visited, I forget where he visited,
I know
and
what you're
and
gonna
somebody was holding up the sign and the sign said "Welcome Potato"
say.
because they didn't put the accent because it's like El Papa, not
Yeah.
Papa.
Yeah.
It could either mean dad or potato,
Yeah.
and there's like
Welcome potato.
you could tell that they spent the most amount, like it was done out of love,
Yeah.
and it was just like confident. I mean, holding the sign and say "Welcome Potato." Yeah, it's a very funny meme, but it's like
Yeah.
that's an example of why Spanish is very complex. It's easier to read.
Yeah.
I think I was able to pick it up on my own like a little quicker, but it's like English is very hard to write, but it is complex in that, it's like the word esposa,
Yeah.
it's wife or handcuff, so stuff like
We
that.
don't have to dissect that one.
Okay, okay.
We don't have to talk about it.
Um, but yeah, stuff
Yeah.
like that is really
Yeah.
interesting. And the more we dove into it, the more we had a lot of conversations and
Yeah.
the
I mean, for
second book.
this one too, coming up with all the plant names, right? Because
Yes.
there's so many like technical names for plants, but there's also, the pothos plant, which is one of the main characters in the book.
Yeah.
I grew up calling it Julieta. And
Julieta.
what did your mom call it?
Uh,
Do you remember?
no, yeah, it was just like
I forget. Maybe a friend of mine told me that she grew up calling those type of plants, just like an ivy,
uh,
pothos plant.
Patos,
She called it
Devil's Ivy,
teléfono.
oh, teléfono.
Telefono. I called it Julieta. And so there's all these like different names for plants
Yeah.
too. What's the tall spiky one that in Spanish is
Oh,
called lengua de suegra,
yeah,
which
which
is
is
mother-in-law's tongue.
yeah, mother-in-law tongue, which is like supposed to be this very cool, like what is it? It produces a bunch of oxygen, cleans the air. It's
Yeah.
supposed to be, but it's like tongue of
The
mother-in-law.
the irony.
um,
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think, thinking about the work of, translators or the importance of having bilingualism and an intentional
mhm,
process behind it is when you think about when you wrote your book, how many versions and edits did you go through? You went through so
a
many
lot.
edits, right? And so translation should never be just like a one thing done in, one time done situation
Yeah.
because it should also go through the same editing process. We went through and I wasn't the only translator involved. I know that
No,
the publisher also had their own
they had their
internal
own translator.
editors.
Yeah.
And we went back and forth, right? Where the editor was like, "Oh, the editor thinks this change should be made." And so it's important to be intentional about putting as much care into the editing process of a Spanish language product because because it's going to reflect on the quality of it. I mean, humor is the hardest thing to translate.
The hardest, right?
Like so many jokes are not going to be the same because you're talking about slang and cultural
Wordplay.
references, wordplay. And so, when I had, my cousin help with the translation, I remember telling you, I was like, yeah, but you're still gonna have to work on this
Oh,
quite
oh,
a
for
bit.
the special, yeah.
Yeah, you can't just like take it and like start reading it off, and using it as is. You're gonna have to sort of
But
like
that's why I wanted it because
edit
I
it.
wanted to sit with it, study it, and then after you distill it a little bit, you're like, I lost a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a lot of it just evaporated, and
Yep.
you have to be okay with it. But in this sense here, like when we're talking about this book, one of the things that does come up often is like, how cool that you were able to write it in this way, and it's like, you were able to capture what's the word like authenticity of how I spoke, right?
Mhm.
It's a Spanglish, Spanish, English, and certain Spanish words were I left that up to my parents. My dad always used to say this. He goes, "You're gonna end up mute. You can't speak Spanish or English
Yeah.
because I grew up speaking Spanish, but then when you start going into school, you start learn. I didn't really have command of the English language till like roughly the fifth grade.
Yeah.
So that in between like starting school and fifth grade is like that was rough. It's like
Yeah.
I don't know how I communicated with my mom and dad. There was a lot of pointing involved and
Yeah.
a lot of try again.
¿Qué quieres, mijo?
Yeah, what do you want? Like a beer, no, water.
I mean, I will also like say that I've learned that I had a very unique advantage, and that was growing up in the border. I was born in El Paso, Texas, but I grew up in Mexico, and most of my like elementary education was in Mexico. So I went to school in Mexico, primaria, secundaria, middle school, and not until high school I started school in the US. And even while I was going to school in the US, I was still living in Mexico, so I was crossing the border every day. And so out of all of my sisters, I spent the most time going to school in Mexico.
Mm,
Now that said, I've also now spent a good amount of time in the US, and like my Spanish isn't perfect, and I'll say silly things and mess up sayings or use wrong words. My mom still laughs because sometimes I'll call her when I'm working on something, translating something. I'll be like, "Mom, what's the right word for this?" Like,
yeah.
I trust my mom more than I trust the internet sometimes.
Yeah, no.
So it's I think that like I learned what a unique privilege it was to grow up in in the best of both worlds, right? Like I grew up with my identity and like both cultures as Mexican and American.
Mhm.
And and then because of that, when I moved around the country, I was able to easily adapt and understand people's cultures in different places.
Right.
And so I'm able to sort of step aside and put aside my own identity to try to understand and create messaging that's targeted specific people. So, I mentioned earlier that I managed, the secretary's social media accounts. I've also managed other executive social media accounts as part of my consulting work. And actually, now that I think of it, none of them have been Mexican. Sometimes I'm ghostwriting for Latinos of different backgrounds. And so I have to do a lot of like studying of how they speak and try to understand and get in their shoes a little bit. I attribute that to being raised in the border. Like you
Yeah.
kind of like grow up learning to assimilate to different places,
Right.
and kind of like ni de aquí ni de allá. Well, actually both. Soy de
Yeah.
aquí y soy de allá.
Yeah, ni de aquí ni de allá, nor here nor there. I'm from nowhere kind of thing.
But I flipped it to say like I can't actually belong anywhere really.
Right.
I think that's a huge attribute to border life, border upbringing.
I've
So
always found
always
that
lots of love.
fascinating.
Yeah.
I've always found that fascinating because even like earlier when you said I would cross the border every morning to go to school. I
Mhm.
remember when I first heard that, being from LA, like I envisioned, even as a Latino, I go like, man, like I know what that means when my dad says it,
Yeah.
across the border.
Yeah.
He's hiding, he's running across, he's trying to like, uh, you know, yeah, it's a whole thing. But,
Yeah.
but to me, it was so like, wow, I didn't know people did that. You
Yeah.
were living in Juarez and you would commute
Yeah.
every day. Like your parents would drive you across and you would go to school and have an American El Paso, Texas education.
Yeah. Yeah. The first year my mom would drive us every day. And I mean, you're talking about you have to wait at the border crossing, which is roughly an average an hour,
Yep.
and then whatever extra drive and commute. So, we're talking about like hour and a half, 2 hours commute to school every morning.
Hmm.
And so my mom would do that twice a day to drop us off and pick us up later. And then after the first year, she was like, enough, you're going to get your own car, which as a high schooler, I was like, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So then I was in charge of driving my sisters and I to school every day.
Wow.
It you kind of take it for granted because when you're in the border, you're like, yeah, like a lot of people cross the border every day to go to work.
It's the norm. Yeah, it
there's
doesn't
a
stick out. It's not a
huge
weird thing.
there's a huge economy of people who do that. Whether people go shopping, whether people go working, whether people go to school. And so it's a very like ordinary everyday thing. And when I moved away and I would talk about it, people were like, "What?
Yeah.
You did that?" This one time, it was so funny. When I was working in the Department of Education, I was having lunch with some colleagues, and this one colleague, you know, he's like, "Man," he's like, "to think that you had to do that every day, you're crossing every day and you grew up in Mexico." And he's like, "Talk about beating the odds and now you're
Yeah, it's like
here?"
she didn't get caught not one
and
time.
and he was like, "Talk about beating the odds and like now how far you come." And I said, "Hold on, hold on. Actually, like I was like, I think you're misrepresenting because like doing that is a huge privilege. Like it's actually a place of privilege to be able to
To have the
cross every
resources to do
day."
that, yeah.
And it was because we were born in the U.S. We lived in Mexico
Chose
because
to live in
my
Mexico.
dad's job was in Juarez,
Right.
and so as a U.S. born citizen, I had the ability to do that, and my parents wanted to make sure that we grew up loving both cultures. And so it was also a lot of intentionality on my parents,
Yeah.
right? And so I was like, that's actually like a place of privilege, that I can't take for granted that I had the ability to have access to both of these countries and love them both.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was perceived as like, I was like, I don't know if he was picturing that I was like running across the
Yeah,
border
that's so
every day
funny.
with my
Yeah.
backpack or
Man, she has great odds. Like, man, buy a lottery ticket,
yeah.
kid.
So I was very lucky. Like I was very lucky and it was a reminder really that like that is coming from a place of privilege to be able to understand and love both sides of my identity.
Yeah, it's like this both sides of the coin situation. It's interesting because here, like one of the things I think that you're like, oh, that's interesting, but it's how I grew up. It's like I spoke Spanish first. That's my first language,
Mhm.
but I learned how to read and write in English before I knew how to read and write in Spanish.
Yeah.
But I learned English after the fact.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I didn't have my parents as people that could teach me that. My parents had very little to no formal education between them. So now I'm put in a position where it's like, I'm encouraged to read, and they know the importance of reading in Spanish, but it's like it's not happening. I'm kind of learning it on my own. It's like,
Mhm.
thank goodness Spanish is a little easier to read. So it's like, as I'm learning English, I'm also learning Spanish, how to write it. But it is a very confusing time, and I think your parents. Kudos to your parents for having that. The vision to say, hey, like we're gonna sacrifice a little bit, but they need to have an American education. But you also grew up in Juarez.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's one of my favorite things. Like
Yeah.
to know that you had that experience growing up.
Yeah, shout out to Juaritos. I always
Juaritos.
love going back to Juaritos. But yeah, I mean, and your experience growing up in the US, for so many different reasons, you know, Latinos or second generation immigrants don't grow up speaking the language.
No.
And I don't know why it's sometimes becomes like a point of contention. It's like we all have different stories. Like we
Yeah.
are the first one to know that like each of our journeys are super different. And so why would somebody who doesn't speak Spanish be less of,
Sure.
a Latino or Mexican American, when our upbringing was so different? Like I
Right.
think it's fascinating that you taught yourself how to read and write in Spanish.
Yeah.
Like that's so cool.
I wouldn't say 100%. I mean, my grammar could be better, but it's like, uh, yeah. I mean, going to the library, the library was such a big thing for me,
Yeah.
and starting with that little bookshelf. We've talked about this before. This little bookshelf is where all those Spanish language books were, and it was a
Mhm.
tiny little white shelf. And once I kind of went through those books and kind of like started learning English, I was able to kind of partake in the rest of the library. But it was a very unique thing, and it felt like how can I say, like a challenge that I was excited to take on. It's like, how how do I enjoy the rest of the library and move on from this one little bookcase?
Mhm.
You know, it's like I grew up knowing and realizing that, you know, language is very complex, and very lucky that I spoke Spanish, because even in my neighborhood there were kids who tried not to speak Spanish. You know, their parents wouldn't let them, you know,
Yeah.
and I understand that journey. That's a very real and
Yeah.
authentic journey, but you're right. It's like, it's always a point of bumping heads where it's like, wait, you know, you're Mexican, you don't speak English. I mean,
Yeah.
Spanish, you know, it's like, yeah, it's like we've seen that situation happen. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Assimilation is real, and this country has a complicated history, right, when it comes to immigration, and we continue to see it today.
mhm,
And so I would never judge anyone for having to do what they needed to do growing up. Um, but I also think it's so funny that you're like, you kind of taught yourself how to read and write, but you have done comedy shows in
yeah,
Spanish in Mexico City.
yeah,
Like, and I always tell you, I'm like, don't try to have your Spanish be perfect,
yeah,
because like it doesn't need to be. Like,
right.
it should be authentic to you, right? And so not only have you done comedy in Spanish, but having now two bilingual, books, like that's really cool. Like, yes, I worked with you on the translation, but it was your initiative that
Yeah,
said it's important to me that these books are available in English and in Spanish. So
yeah,
like that's something to be really proud of, baby.
yeah.
I'm very proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate. I'm proud of you. I mean, you know, having this conversation, it's like, you know, definitely things that we've talked about before, but it's cool. It's like
Yeah.
when we have this conversation again, it's like that. That is pretty cool, and I think we both have a shared love for books and education and telling stories and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So it's like I think that we do share that, and that's one of the things
Yeah.
that kind of, you know, brought us together, is like this love for storytelling and comedy and this and
Yeah.
that. So.
Yeah, it's super fun. I mean, and like thinking about assimilation, like
Mhm.
I love explaining the why I have multiple names. And it has to do also with navigating being the US, with like first generation, because and this will clear up, I think, why people get confused as to why sometimes you introduce me as Vidi and sometimes you introduce me as
Yes.
Adria.
Yes, I get that a lot. I get that a lot. It's like, "Wait, what is her name? Tell her to
Which
pick
one
one."
which one of your girlfriends are you bringing around
Right.
this time? But growing up in Juarez, my first name, like, I don't know why my family defaulted to call me Viri, which is short for my middle name. So my middle name is Viridiana,
Right.
and so I always grew up as Viri. And when I started school in the US, in high school, in the US, people default to the first name, which is not always the case in Mexico. And I think, just people read it in English. And so my first name is Adria, but people in school called me Adria.
Right.
And so for the longest time, like my school name was Adria, but my friends and family name was Viri,
Yeah.
right? For the longest time. I think professionally, everybody that I've worked with calls me Adria. And then people would be like, "Why is your name Viri on social?" "Oh, it's my nickname. It's my
Right.
nickname." But then another unexpected thing happened, that when I moved to LA,
Okay.
which was in the last
Yeah.
5 years, um, now career, peers, professionals, because there's so many Latinos here, people default to call me by my first name, but they say in Spanish, say Adria, which is also correct, but I never grew up using that name, so it was super weird for me to get used to hearing now Adria.
Yeah.
So now some people call me Adria, some people call me Adria,
Right.
some people call me Viri, and I guess they're all fine. Like they're all
I'm so glad you're talking about this, because it really is like, if you look at the book, like if you see both of the books, you see Jesus with the little, I don't know what to call it. I always whistle.
the
Yeah,
accent
the
or
accent,
the emphasis.
emphasis. See it? I don't know. See, we're learning stuff. But if you look at the title, you're seeing Jesus. It has the thing over the U, and I didn't grow up writing that.
Mhm.
You know, it's like if you look at my ID, it doesn't have it. So technically, my name is Jesus Trejo.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, you pronounce it in Spanish, and that's what it's supposed to be. So, on shows, on flyers, on, you know, credits for projects and this kind of thing, it's always Jesus. So it wasn't until the books started, you know, working on the books, that my name was Jesus Trejo. and even the character, that's something I there's something about Mexican or Latino culture that you have your government name and then you have this kind of family given name
Yeah.
or like friend name, and it's interesting for me.
Yeah.
When your name is Jesus, your nickname is Chewy. You
Yeah.
know, Chewy, and it's I don't know where that comes from. It's not even close to it,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like somebody is like, yeah, like Viridiana, Viri. It's close. You could see it, but for
Yeah.
Jesus, it's Chewy. And I debated when I was writing the book, do I call the little character Chewy or
Oh,
Jesucito?
yeah.
So I did go through these things. I thought about it. I had to make a choice. You know, we ended up going, leaving the name Jesus because also, why I second guessed it? Because I'm like in middle America, like it might be taken the wrong way where it's like, wait, like confusing if
Yeah.
they're not familiar with Latino culture, but
Yeah.
we kept it that way.
I
So
like Little Jesus. I think it was
little
a
Jesus,
good choice.
I think little Jesus really encapsulates like me being Mexican American,
Mhm.
little Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So it's little, Spanish, English, there's like kind of like a balance there,
Yeah.
as opposed to Jesucito, which is like, little Jesus in Spanish. But I don't know. I'm glad we went with what we went with there.
It's
So
also funny that a lot of non-Spanish speakers will be the first ones to bring up like some religious reference.
sure.
Whereas with Latinos, we're so used to seeing that name
Yeah, it's not a big
in
deal.
addition to the religious, Jesus, but
Yeah.
we are so used to seeing so many Jesus and Marias and
Yeah, Jesus.
Guadalupes,
Yeah.
so I think we just kind of like are used to it.
Yeah, both of my grandmas, their first name was Maria de Jesus.
Mhm.
And, when your name is Maria de Jesus, you also get the name of Chuy,
Yeah.
So both of my
Yeah.
grandmas were, we call them, Nina Chuy, and,
Yeah.
I was a Chuy as well, but not without the Maria part.
Yeah.
So
Wait, did anyone ever call you Chewy growing up?
yeah,
They did?
yeah,
No way. I just learned something new.
yeah. Yeah,
Wait.
my dad teases me with that because he knows that I don't really like it.
Yeah.
Well, as a kid, I didn't like it. As a grown up, I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, Chewy. But it started with a neighbor. It was a little baby, and she used to say Chewy, but she used to say it like very like kid like she used to go Chewy, and so my dad like whenever he wanted to get my attention or like kind of rib me a little bit, he's like
Yeah.
he would go Chewy because he knew I would get like stop, don't do that, like not in front of my friends. So
Yeah. I mean, we love a good nickname.
yeah. And there was another a nickname too that I used to be called, and you're like, wait, why do they call you that?
Oh, was it coño?
Coño. So coño is a bad word.
Oh, no.
Excuse me.
Now we're giving your follower ideas of what to call you. This
What
might
if it
backfire,
sticks?
baby.
It's gonna backfire for sure. But my cousins and aunts and yeah, a lot of family members that were like, so again with the middle name,
Yeah.
my middle name is Antonio.
Yeah.
So the nickname for someone named Antonio is Toño, right?
Mhm.
So uh, I think it started. Yeah, I think it started with my cousin not being able to pronounce or say Toño as a baby, and she like said it like very funny, like Coño, and
Yeah.
it stuck. And I remember one time being called Coño. It's like you don't think of it. It's like, hey, that's my nickname. And then someone's like, hey, why do they keep cussing at this little kid? He seems to be living his life and
Yeah.
just hanging out or whatever. He's like, you keep cussing. He's like, no, that's his name. He goes, really?
Yeah.
There's no way. And then, explaining that story. But, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, language is if if Spanish isn't already complex, we're adding this other layer of names and things to it.
I mean, we could talk for hours about all the different, you know, Spanish words that are different in different countries. Like, I had a little bit of a time working in Argentina a long time ago, but I was down there working for 6 months, and there were some words. I mean, specifically, there were a lot of words I don't remember, but like pants and shirt and like specific, very normal, like everyday words had different names.
Okay.
And so, I mean, the one that comes to mind right now is like aguacate or avocado. It's called palta.
Palta?
Yeah, and so it's not even they don't even sound alike.
Palta?
Mhm.
Palta?
But the funny ones
Uh-huh.
were like, I was working there at an office and there was I was complaining about someone at that job and I was saying this and that, que es un pendejo. I'm cursing now. I don't know
Yeah.
if we're allowed to curse in your
There
podcast.
goes the monetization on YouTube. Thank you guys. This podcast ends with
Well,
episode
but
2. Yeah.
technically, so in Argentina,
Yeah.
pendejo means like little kid. Like
Really?
like in Mexico we call like chamaco,
Okay.
like a brat. And so, when I was talking to my colleague and I was saying, "Oh, so and so is un pendejo." And then she goes, "Yeah, I mean, he's a little immature, but she thought it was like a strange choice of words.
Yeah. Yeah, for
I was
sure.
like, "Oh yeah, this means something different here."
That's so funny. Yeah, that has to be jarring when you like the meaning of one word. You're like, wait, how are you using it right
Yeah.
now? Slow down.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, thank you so much for doing this podcast. I wanted to. It was very important to me that we start off the podcast with the book. People get to know like a little bit of why I'm so into books and why they mean so much to me. But I also wanted to, as Eliza, shout out to Eliza Kinks, the illustrator. She put it on the cover.
Oh, that
Uh,
meant so much to me.
Traducido por Adria
Yeah.
Márquez. So it's
That was such a beautiful surprise. And just I think having worked on this book now, I also realize that like the work of so many translators and publishing goes unnoticed. And so I don't take that for granted because it took a lot of work, a lot of intentionality. And so thank you so much, Eliza, for doing that. That
yes.
meant so much.
And Maria Russo and team that was that they were open, to having us
Yeah.
work together and preserve the authenticity of the language. And hopefully we can keep working and building on it and creating more books.
Will you hire me again, baby?
Well, you just cuss, so and I was like, of course. Yeah, thank you so much. It meant the world to me, and yeah, we had to do an episode with the translator, so here it is. Thank you guys for
And the
watching.
wifey.
And the wife. Yes.
To come here and embarrass you with all my cheesy nicknames.
Yes. Thank you everybody for watching, for listening. Please tell a friend, share it. We're trying to get the word out. Subscribe. There it is. Hit that little bell. Because if you hit the little bell, you know what happens when we upload the episode. You are the first to know, and make sure you watch it. And also just throwing it out there. Any sponsors, anybody who wants to sponsor the podcast, email us at info@JesusTrejo.com. That's info@JesusTrejo.com. Sponsors, yeah, we plan to do so much more with the podcast, and we can do it with your support, and we'll shout you out. We'll read copy, whatever it is. We're off to a great start, and that's because of you guys. So thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time.
Yes, and get the books in Spanish.